Thank you.
All right, so let's jump right into this. I'm going to rocket through this. I've got a lot of content to share. The primary bulk of this is going to be revolving around DDoS, what we're seeing in the DDoS landscape, what it looks like from trends perspectives, what are attackers doing, how are they changing up their techniques really to take down networks, how they're advancing and evolving. And so this report and presentation takes place kind of the second half of 2019. And we compare that segment of time to the previous year's same period of time. And we do that specifically because when you think the end of the year, you have holidays, you have Christmas, you have Thanksgiving, you have all these different things occurring, and naturally you see increased activity. And so what we like to do is compare one snapshot with the previous snapshot to see how things have changed. So let's just dig right into this. We're going to talk about DDoS. We're going to go into IoT. We'll talk a little bit about the malware. I'll give you a little update on what's happening in the APT world. So this is going to be your country-to-country espionage type stuff. And then a little bit on crime, what's happening in the crime space. So let's dig into DDoS. Here's some of the kind of key things that we want to pull out. And you'll see that the title of this actually has details about our WISR, our 14th annual WISR, which is Worldwide Infrastructure Surveillance Report. One of the things that we did for this particular presentation is I pulled that out specifically because there's a lot of survey things, and some of the actual breakouts and the different graphs and diagrams are a little bit hard to read in kind of this format. But if you go to the link that I have here at the bottom, netscout.com/threat report, you can actually download the PDF, and that'll give you all of the WISR data. So if you're interested in what carriers and what enterprises are seeing in terms of DDoS and various other attacks, and it's not just specific to DDoS, it actually goes through and lists what are the top threats that an enterprise or a carrier network are experiencing in general across the landscape. So it's definitely worth checking out. So if you do have time, please feel free to download that and make sure that you're tracking that as well. Okay, so some of the other things that we want to do is look at the different techniques and tactics that attackers are using. So there's actually 7 different vectors that we've either identified or have seen attackers use more frequently. We'll get into those. We'll talk a little bit about collateral damage, and then we'll go right into APT-related stuff, specifically on the mobile side of the house. And then we talk about IoT, but a little spin here for intensification of threats, because things are getting bigger, they're getting badder, and it's getting a lot more difficult to mitigate some of these things. Okay, so this is just a really quick snapshot here. This is a call out specifically to what we call Cyber Threat Horizon. Anybody has access to this. In fact, if you go to the URL, anybody can register, you can get an account. And it's cool because you're able to see attacks as they're occurring. It's near real time. And you can create what we call neighborhoods. And I bring this up specifically because a lot of the statistics that you're going to see later on, it's all derived from the data that we have fueling this dashboard. And so this is a really good way to get kind of a high-level picture of what's happening around the cyber threat landscape specific to DDoS attacks. We have some plans to move into more malware-centric stuff later with this in the future, but right now it's primarily focused on the DDoS space. Okay, so a little spin on Guy Fawkes here. Remember 8.4 million. So if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember that's the number of attacks we saw in 2019. 23,000 per day, 16 per minute DDoS attacks. And these could be low volume DDoS attacks. It could be multi-vector. It could be single targeted UDP floods. It could be your really large attacks. In fact, we have the 1.7 terabit per second attack that occurred. We recently saw a 1.2 terabit per second attack, and so sometimes they're high volume. More often than not, though, they're actually kind of smaller volumes, and I'll get into that in a couple slides here. But first off, we identified 7 new vectors or increasingly used vectors. Some of the new ones would be ARMS, which is App Remote Management Service. So if you have a Mac and it's an enterprise device, there's a really good chance that this service is enabled because your IT needs to get in and actually go in and do some management. Well, the byproduct of that is now you're vulnerable to be a reflector amplifier for these DDoS networks. IPMI, RMCP, so this is taking advantage of specifically hardware that has a vulnerability in it that allows for amplification of traffic. Some of these you've seen around for a while, OpenVPN, HTML5, Ubiquity, they've been around for a while, but we're seeing more and more use of them. And we've got some cool narratives around these that I'm going to get into in the following slides. 20.4 billion. This is the number of IoT devices that are projected to connect to the internet this year. So that is a lot of IoT devices. That is a lot of footprint on the internet that attackers have access to and can take advantage of it. And IoT is a very scary space, and we're going to get into why that is here in the coming slides. And this is just one reason why it's bad, right? Mirai. Mirai is the predominant IoT malware out there. And we're seeing a 57% increase from 2018 to 2019 for the number of unique variants that are circulating in the wild. So you can clearly see on this chart on the bottom here, I mean, you go from 34,000 to end of 2019, we're talking over 220,000 unique Mirai samples circulating in the wild. And when you look at kind of the evolution and the exponential increase of IoT devices, they're kind of growing together. And you see that as we expand our footprint, the threat continues to grow. This is that intensification of threats that we played on earlier. Top 4 verticals, I show this mostly to say that there's really not a whole lot of change here. It's your wired telecoms, your telecommunications, your hosting providers, wireless. This is all par for the course. And what's interesting though is I would say about 90 to 95% of the attacks here. So when you look at the attack frequency, that's the count that we saw for this period of time, 6 months, remember. So 1 million on wired telecoms, 575,000 on telecom. This predominantly is attacks against gamers. So targeting broadband access points in order to take down networks of maybe competitive gaming. The esports world is getting huge, and gambling on esports is getting even bigger. And there's millions and billions of dollars at risk here. And so all it really takes is a very fast, very powerful attack to take down a network of a potential competition. And it only has to be for a couple of minutes, if that, in order to throw a match or for money to exchange hands. It doesn't have to be really a long-lived attack. It's not going to be something that's going to be the 1 terabit per second attacks. No, you just want to get in there. You want to disrupt as quickly, as efficiently as possible in order to do something, which in this case is motivated by most likely fame or monetary gain. And so a lot of times when you see these attacks and you see these particular high-level verticals, that's what we're talking about is a lot of it is just gaming. And wireless telecoms is in there because a lot of the Asian community uses wireless access points in order to do their gaming. It's getting more and more popular. And so we'll see that trend kind of adopt across the world, but that's why these are here. So one thing that's really notable though, if you actually look at the report that we have, we talk about different verticals that are there. And it used to be that we would have the top 10 verticals, what we saw, but there wasn't a whole lot of movers. So we kept the top 4, but specifically the very left-hand call out here is around satellite telecoms. And we put this on here because what we saw, we actually saw some attacks, and it really was kind of showboating. You had a bunch of these attackers out there, and they were saying, hey, look what I can do, or they're trying to get more customers. There was some rumor that there was extortion going on here, but predominantly this is like showboating. And they're like, hey, we're going to launch attacks against these financial institutions in Asia Minor and Europe. Well, little did they know that a lot of the IP footprint for these financial institutions was using satellite IP space. And so what happened is they started targeting all of these telecoms with this new technique that we're going to talk about on the next slide. And the byproduct was that satellite took a pretty heavy hit, and a lot of the network space got knocked out. And so just because of that incident, we actually saw satellite telecoms as one of the top 10 verticals targeted by DDoS in 2019, which is a fairly significant increase because we've never actually seen satellite show up that high before. The rest of these are just kind of some significance that we saw. We dug a little bit into these, but really without some of the background on some of these, it's hard to kind of pick out a motivation for these. Sometimes what we'll see is like a new tool is released, or there's more reflectors amplifiers that are available, or maybe there's the attacker that's always hitting them, but then all of a sudden now they have a new list of reflectors that increases the attacks against them or increases the potency. And so you'll see some of these kind of have changes periodically. The last one there, attackers eyeing airwaves, that's part of that wireless telecom that you saw on the previous page, which as you can see, a 600% increase year over year is pretty incredible. Okay, so DDoS attackers kind of innovating and adapting. What we're seeing here is it's kind of a threefold approach that we're seeing. Attackers are not only doing their recon, they're also monitoring the efficacy of their attacks, and they're adding new techniques. So let's break these down. So what we're seeing with recon, we actually mitigated an attack recently where attackers, they scanned the attack, their targeted network, and they found out where the boundaries were. So as like a ISP or a carrier or a really big enterprise, one of the things you do is you have a network footprint, right? So maybe you have a couple of ASNs, maybe you have some CIDR blocks or what have you. and you have that footprint. Now, anything in that footprint is kind of your home space, right? So you're more likely to trust traffic that's coming from your home space than something that's external to that. Well, attackers get wise to that as well. And so they start scanning these footprints and they identify, hey, this is the boundaries of what's good, right? So maybe they do some test packets and they figure out what the reply looks like, what the response looks like, and say, hey, this actually works. So now what they're going to do is they're going to try to get control of a lot of nodes inside that kind of home network. And then they're going to use that as a platform to launch their DDoS attacks. That mitigates that first layer of kind of protections that maybe somebody has. So they do that. They start launching attacks, and maybe they choose DNS amplification. And so that's not working the way they want it to. They're doing some ping requests. Maybe they're checking down detector. They don't see any outages. Okay, let's pivot. Let's add a couple of vectors here, see if that works. That doesn't work. Let's change it. Let's go carpet bombing. So now instead of targeting one destination, I'm going to have the entire CIDR block or ASN for that area, and I'm going to launch traffic at it in order to stay underneath the threshold of what would be mitigated by normal DDoS mitigation measures. So let's just say as an organization, I say I don't care about any traffic unless it reaches 5 gigabit per second volume. So an attacker might test that. And so they might start launching attacks, see where that threshold is and when their stuff starts dropping off. And then they back off. And then they take the entire CIDR block or ASN and they say, I'm going to send that volume of traffic to every single one of those destinations. Well, now you have this massive inbound flood of traffic saturating every single pipe, and that creates just as many problems. But there's more. Let's add TCP SYN to that, which historically has been hard to mitigate for a lot of people. So now, not only do you have all of these different vectors, now you have an entire new vector that leverages other capabilities that are very hard to mitigate. And not only that, you're targeting maybe tens of thousands of IP addresses all at the same time. It is a very effective tactic. And as attackers start monitoring as their attacks occur, they can pivot on the fly super, super easy. And it's really hard for, as a defender, to mitigate all those different threats inbound. So it's really important to stay abreast of all of these tactics that attackers are using. And so really that's one of the newest techniques we're seeing is this carpet bombing with the TCP SYN attacks. And it has been very effective in a lot of instances. Okay, so this is getting into the fun stuff. We did kind of a case study into the different vectors. And I had a lot of questions, which I'll show you the questions on the next slide. But just to break this down, this chart for you, on the right-hand side, we have what we call our periodic table of DDoS attack vectors. There's a lot of information here. And again, download the PDF. You can have this. You can blow it up. Maybe you can put it on a poster on your wall, whatever you want to do. The top right is the maximum amplification factor that we have seen. So for instance, CoAP version 1 is up there right now. So we have it 34 to 1. So one packet generating 34. That's the ratio.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. The little radials indicate the number of reflectors we know about in the wild. So I encourage you just to go and kind of dive into this a little bit. Okay, so getting into the kind of interesting things. Here's my questions. How long does it take for a vector to get cleaned up? Does it grow? Does it decay as it's brought to light? And which ones pose the greatest risk? And my answer to that, well, you can't really predict. And the reason for that, and you'll see on the right-hand side, the daily growth or removal of these vectors. But this is kind of like a life cycle. You see CoAP grows, you see OpenVPN grows, you see some of these kind of level out, and you see ubiquity go down. The story behind these is that CoAP is part of IoT devices. So as IoT devices enter the network, the vulnerability increases. As more people move to use VPNs, OpenVPN increases. Ubiquity happens to be a protocol used in routers in network devices that usually have admins behind them. So you see that diminishment of the available vectors because IT personnel know this and they start mitigating that. And so it's really interesting. And so the story is that we can't really predict for all of these different vectors. Now, this is probably the most interesting part of all of this. It turns out that attackers are using very few of the available servers out there. CoAP is a really good example. In fact, for CoAP, we had roughly somewhere in the millions of devices. But when you actually look at attacks and you see how many servers attackers are using, they're using less than 0.5% of the available reflectors amplifiers for that vector. That is huge, right? And so when you start looking at the size of CoAP attacks, we've seen 300 gigabit per second attacks. And if they're only using less than 0.5%, that's pretty significant. So what happens when an attacker decides, I'm going to use every single CoAP server out there to launch my attack? What happens then? We don't know. And so there's a lot of outstanding questions here. And that really just really quickly will blast through the IoT section here. Again, 20.4 billion, 50%, 7% increase in IoT devices. And you see on the right-hand side, all of the OS architectures that Mirai is ported to. Then you see 51% increase in brute forcing attacks, 87% increase in exploitation attempts. All of these paint a picture of what it looks like as attackers are setting up these networks. And that all plays a role into the number of reflectors, amplifiers that we saw on the previous page that are used for attacks. And so this thing is very real. It's very, very concerning. Brute force versus exploitation chart on the left, right-hand side, top 10 passwords. Again, download the PDF. But notably here at the top, there's a few kind of movements right now for securing IoT devices, but it's not enough. You have the OWASP project, you have ETSI, you have California Senate bill where use adequate level of security for these. But what does that mean? What does it mean to secure an IoT device? Because as a manufacturer, I want to pump these things out as fast as I possibly can. I want to make them user-friendly, which means, is a user really going to plug in an IoT device and the first thing they do, go to the admin panel and change the default credentials? Probably not. And so it's a very concerning area that we need to be cognizant of, because as enterprises, as carriers, there are tons of IoT devices either in our organizations or for our consumers. So what are we doing to mitigate these? It's something that we all need to be concerned about. And I've got a couple minutes, sorry, 1 minute?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, perfect. Okay, so mobile malware, a lot of the APT adversaries that we're seeing, they use it to track their own internal citizens, whether they're dissenters, they're protesters, they're journalists. They use it to kind of monitor and do censorship. They also look at near abroad countries, so right across the border, looking at kind of geopolitical interests. But not only do they create their own, they also leverage third-party services. And so here's 3 different countries that we see. China uses something called Poison Carbon Collar Spy. Vietnam uses both custom and third-party. And then Iran uses Gulf Spy and this mobile anagram. And they use these to infect not only their own people, but also external folks for monitoring. We're seeing the growth of this. And then you have third-party organizations like Hacking Team and FinFisher that have over-the-counter commercial solutions for this APT malware that they're able to leverage. Really quick on Emotet. This is a deep dive specifically in Emotet. There's a lot more details in the PDF. But we wanted to look at, like, what does it look like? Because Emotet and then TrickBot are the 2 predominant families in the crime space right now. And so one of the things we focused on was, let's get to the source of threats, because it used to be Emotet distributed TrickBot. So in my mind, the theory is if we block Emotet, we also block TrickBot. And so when we actually look at the numbers, it's true, right? So over a 6-month period of time, you have the same amount of samples for Emotet and TrickBot. We have 300,000 notifications of victims of Emotet, but only 50,000 for TrickBot. So that theory works. And so that's what we do here, is we try to get kind of closer to the source for mitigating these. And it works from a threat landscape perspective. You want to kind of cut the head off the snake. So if we can get it at the earlier stages of an intrusion, then we can block any follow-on stages. And this is true for any really downloader type malware that maybe distributes ransomware or some other secondary payload. So that's it. Perfect. Good time. All right. Any questions, let me know. I'm happy to answer anything you guys have. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Richard. Cesar, are there any questions for Richard? ¿Hay alguna pregunta?
Sí, gracias, Macarena. Sí tenemos una pregunta. Thank you very much, Richard. We have one question. Kevin, may ask a question for Richard, please?
Sí, gracias, César. La pregunta viene de Eduardo Preve. ¿Con qué frecuencia se producen los ataques que dijo? Diarios por hora. Habló de 1 millón de redes de telecomunicaciones y más de 575,000 en ataques a las comunicaciones en información y los procesos de datos, hosting, servicios relacionados en la nube. También dijo que se pierden billones de dólares debido a estos ataques. ¿Hay una estimación de una cifra real de pérdida de los ataques? ¿En qué regiones se pierde más dinero?
Okay, I think I've got it. Don't worry. I used Google Translate, my cool kung fu here. So you're talking about number of attacks, whether that's daily, hourly, talking about the different verticals, telecommunications versus others, but then what that means for actual losses for organizations. So one of the things that we identified actually as we were doing this exercise was we wanted to find out what that dollar amount was. we didn't actually get to in this threat report, but it's something that we're considering doing for the next one. And so we do these reports twice per year. And there's a lot of question around what does this mean from a monetization standpoint for a carrier network and enterprise? What dollar amount does it actually cost for these organizations for DDoS, right? Because if an ISP is predominantly defending against these disgruntled gamers that are 13-year-olds paying $50 on the underground to launch attacks, and they're spending millions and millions of dollars for this, that's kind of a frightening concept that a 13-year-old can literally cost you millions of dollars in damage. And that is something that we want to do. I will say that we haven't got to it yet for the statistics that I just showed you. And as far as the actual numbers we had, so 8.4 million attacks was for the course of 2019. And then that's equates to about 23,000 attacks per day, 16 attacks per minute. And again, those statistics are in the PDF, so I definitely encourage you to get those, and then you can look at those. But stay tuned for the next report, because I really do want to do some of this. What does it mean for an organization? What is the kind of dollar amount there? And it's something that's kind of near and dear to us, especially since we live and breathe this, and this is kind of how we make our money, right? So being able to go to a customer and say, hey, this is actually the cost-benefit analysis is something that we want to do from an attacker's perspective. We already do that in the business sense, right? So that's what our SCs and our sales reps do, is they look at the kind of the environment and competitive intel. But I want to look at it from what actual attacks cost. And so, yeah, so that's something we're planning on doing for the next one.
We also have another question from Oscar Cárdenas. ¿Qué medidas preventativas se pueden tomar para evitar los ataques para los dispositivos de IoT en los dispositivos perimetrales de seguridad? What measures are taken to avoid attacks on IoT devices?
Yeah, on perimeter. Yeah, I've got it. That's a tricky one. And this is why IoT is so scary to me. When people ask me, like, what are you most scared about in the coming years for threat intel? It is IoT, because what can you do? It used to be people would say, well, let's put it behind a firewall. But the reality is there's lots of malware out there now that can actually get around a firewall. So does that really make sense? I don't know. It doesn't make sense to just say, hey, as an enterprise, you're not going to bring any non-approved device into the office because we don't want to risk that. As a consumer, how do you do this, right? Can you go and tell all of your consumers that, hey, you're running vulnerable versions of IoT and you're contributing to these DDoS? Well, maybe that's something that we can do. But the reality is the responsibility on this really goes down to what is law being able to enforce on the manufacturers to put in like an adequate measure of security into these devices. They have to be able to have non-default credentials and passwords, because brute forcing these devices is what Mirai is good at. And it's still king. It's the primary way that IoT devices are compromised. If you go back a couple of reports that we did, any IoT device connected to the internet within 5 minutes starts to receive brute forcing attacks. Within 24 hours, it's getting exploitation attempts. And so it's very imperative that manufacturers are cognizant of this fact and start securing the devices. And that's really where we have to start. We have to come together as a community and say, this has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we need to take some drastic measures to say that we're not going to allow these in our networks, because it is a very real threat and it's very, very difficult to mitigate.
Thank you, Richard. And the last question, Kevin.
Con nodo no se menciona ransomware en los incidentes presentados, pero cada vez más en reportes de seguridad se mencionan estos casos. ¿Cuál es su percepción de los riesgos de ransomware frente a los ataques presentados?
Yes. Ransomware, yeah, yep. Ransomware is every time I get asked this question, I have to pause, because my previous organization, I was working for FireEye, and prior to that, iSIGHT Partners, and that was my bread and butter. I was the ransomware go-to person, and I know how scary ransomware is. I know how it's distributed. I know all of the ins and outs of it, even the latest ones such as Maze and various others that are kind of making the rounds. And here's the reality. So from our perspective, at least from NETSCOUT's perspective, one of the things that we try to do is we do have the capability to block outbound C2 comms. But let's face it, if you have a ransomware malware family that is beaconing out to command and control, chances are it's already encrypted. So at that point, what can we do? So it goes back to the last slide that I presented before the conclusion here, is that we try to get closer to the source of an intrusion or an infection vector. And so one of the things that I've instructed my team to do is, let's focus on what distributes these other malware families. how is Maze ransomware getting inside networks? How is TrickBot? How is all these other banking malwares? How are all these other ransomware families getting in? Is it spam messaging? Is it malicious macro documents? Like, what is the primary method? And it turns out it's very varied. In fact, a lot of the more recent ransomware scares haven't actually occurred through something that you can mitigate with an indicator of compromise, because what they're doing is they're brute forcing vulnerabilities in devices such as RDP or using SMB lateral transfers. Let's go back to JBoss, right? With SamSam targeting like health institutions and various other local governments. Those are vulnerabilities in inherent services running on systems that they're first brute forcing. They get a foothold. Maybe they do whatever they want. Maybe they exfiltrate data. Maybe they look for certain things that they're interested in. And then, oh, well, guess what? Let's just deploy ransomware anyway. So not only did we steal all your data, but now we're actually going to hold it ransom and get an additional kind of leg up on you. And so for things like that, the best advice I can say is that you need to have adequate patching. So as vulnerabilities come out, as use cases come out, as proof of concept code comes out, you need to make sure you're patching immediately. And I know the patch cycles can last a long time in some organizations, but it's imperative that that happens. And then you want a layered approach. You don't want to have all of your crown jewels directly exposed or even one hop in. You want to be able to have some segmentation so that if an attacker did get in, they couldn't pivot laterally to your systems. Maybe that's some form of two-factor authentication where you have to have physical access to a machine. I don't know what it is, but that layered approach is also really critical. Being able to have those backups stored in a place that you can't reach any other way except physically, or some other method that doesn't connect to the rest of your systems. Those are kind of the best practices that I have for ransomware right now. If it's distributed by email, making sure you have a good email filter provider, some type of iron port or something like that that monitors for malicious attachments, URLs and things like that. So more and more we get these questions about ransomware, and really it's tough for me wanting to do something and knowing that if you see C2s for ransomware, it's already too late. And so we're doing the best that we can to get closer to that source of infection in order to mitigate the ransomware piece.
Thank you, Richard. No more time. Just for future reference, may you confirm us an email to question or whatever?
Yes. So I had it on a slide, but it's richard.hummel, Hummel, at netscout.com. And yes, feel free. I'm happy to do any kind of follow-up question and answer.
Thank you.